Hello, hello. I see people logging on. I'm gonna wait just a couple, probably like 30 seconds till everyone's logged on. Hello. Hello, Stephen. Hello, Adam. I see everybody in the comments. Hello, hello. Yeah, we're gonna do something a little bit new today compared to what we've done on Facebook and what we've done on Instagram before, and I hope you guys like it. Just give people just a couple minutes to get logged on and set up. I think you're gonna really like this. I'm pretty proud of what we're gonna talk about today. Hi, Robert. Hello, William. Hello, Jose. Thank you for logging on. Oh yes, we're gonna talk about the election. I see those comments. Don't you worry, we're gonna talk about it. So what I thought we would do today, instead of starting out with the questions like we've done in the past, and in the past we've done Ask Me Anything where I just log on and basically introduce myself and then take your questions and answer them. I have a list of preemptively asked questions about the election that are really important to answer. If you turn on the mainstream media, any of the mainstream networks, you are not going to find the answers to these questions. I've done the research and I will tell you the truth, as well as my opinion, of course. So I thought today that we would go through some of the following questions. Here are some of the questions that need to be answered. Is there voter fraud? Did voter fraud occur in the 2020 election? And if so, was it significant enough to steal the election? That's question number one. Putting voter fraud aside, and we'll get to the answers. I'm going to tell you the questions first. Putting voter fraud aside, what happened in this election? Why was it not a landslide for Donald Trump like it should have been? What happened? Does Joe Biden have a mandate like he claims? Will Biden and Harris, should they be certified as the winners of this election, will they govern in a moderate manner like both of them claim and like their supporters claim? Is this a time for healing and for unity, as the Democrats claim? And what is up with the Democrats' enemies list, their hit list, and what do we as conservatives do now? Those are all the questions that we're going to tackle tonight, questions that people have been asking me over the course of the past week. It is quite unbelievable that it has been a full week since the election, and yet here we are. So you can submit questions. We'll see if we have time for them at the end. You can submit them in the little questions box. But for right now, we'll start with these. Is there voter fraud? If you go on Twitter, they'll tag every tweet that you say anything about voter fraud and tell you that it's a contested claim. If there was voter fraud, is it significant enough to litigate, as President Trump is doing? Is it significant enough to steal the election and change the election? So first of all, in case you hadn't heard, Attorney General William Barr authorized federal prosecutors to pursue what he called substantial allegations of voting irregularities. And this should happen, Barr says, before the 2020 presidential election is certified. This is a pretty big deal. This is validation for those who are claiming that we need to litigate, validation for those who claim that voter fraud has been happening, validation for a lot of the anecdotes that we have heard. Because this is what I think is the real sticking point for a lot of people. Between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. on election night, something happened in multiple cities. In the city of Detroit, in Atlanta, in Milwaukee, in Philadelphia. And between those hours, between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., something happened that changed the course of the election, the outcome of the election. Those states were solidly in Trump's corner. That something happened, and suddenly those states tilted towards Biden. So the question is, why did they stop counting? And then why did they suddenly restart counting? And why were all of those ballots for Joe Biden? So these things are valid questions to ask, and I would encourage all of you to ignore mostly liberal pundits or people on Twitter who say that you can't ask the questions. That's certainly not true. We should ask the questions. It's not a conspiracy to ask the questions. That being said, we do need proof and evidence that voter fraud happened in order to claim that an election is stolen. We can't rely simply on an anecdote or a video that we saw on Twitter or the fact that we wanted, another candidate to win. We have to have proof and evidence. So the question is, do we? Do we have proof and evidence that voter fraud happened? The answer to that question is yes. That's it's not even a controversial take. Of course, there is voter fraud. There's always voter fraud. There was in the last election and the election before, and there is voter fraud in this election. So before we get into some of the examples of the voter fraud that needs to be investigated, I want to read a quote to you from the former governor of Illinois, Rod Blagojevich. You might know him from his time in prison. You might know him because he was part of the corrupt Democrat establishment in the city of Chicago. This is what he said in answer to the question about the integrity of this election. He said, and I quote, "If the question is, are the Democrats stealing votes in Philadelphia? My answer is the Pope Catholic? It's a time-honored tradition," he said. "Big Democrat-controlled cities like Chicago, my hometown, Philadelphia, to do precisely what they're doing now. I've never seen such a magnitude, because this, I think, is an indication of just how widespread it is, how deep it is. And I don't think it's just confined to Philadelphia. My instincts," he says, again, coming out of Chicago Democratic politics, "my instincts tell me it's going on in Atlanta, it's going on in Detroit, it's going on in Milwaukee, it's going on in Las Vegas." And coming out of the Democrat Chicago political establishment, he says, "I know how they operate. They control polling places. They stop votes when their candidate's behind. And then in the wee hours of the morning, in the dark of the night, the stealing starts." And we've seen that, he says, in big numbers, unprecedented numbers in this election, in Michigan, and in Philadelphia. So the reason and that's the end of his quote. The reason I think it's important to read that is sometimes the clues for what's going on come from people who have been involved in the wrongdoing before. So when it's not just someone who's solidly in Trump's corner, when it's not just somebody who's bitter that Biden won, when someone who has been involved, who is in the know about voter fraud, explains to you how it's done and says, "This looks like it to me," that's an indication to us that we should keep looking. So let's keep looking. If we're looking for proof and evidence, I have compiled, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, 9 quick examples of voter fraud allegations that certainly need to be investigated. I mean, this stuff is crazy. Number 1, the chair of the Michigan Republican Party has revealed that corrupt software, this is the Dominion voting machines you might have heard about, has flipped thousands of votes from Trump to Biden. This is what the chair says. Ballots were counted for Democrats that were meant for Republicans. The tabulating software glitched. We now have discovered that 47 counties use the same software. So is that worthy of investigation? Is that worthy of litigation? You bet. What if that actually happened? And there's indication, there's probable cause to think that it did. Of course, that's not just anecdotal, that's not just sour grapes. We should look into that. And everybody should want to look into that because it's our votes, the integrity of our votes that's at stake. That's example number 1. Example number 2, the Nevada Republican Party sent a criminal referral to Attorney General Barr citing 3,000 instances of voter fraud. This is not a broad, vague, empty allegation. These are 3,000 specific examples of fraud. Now, will that flip the election there? I don't know. No, maybe, yes, maybe, who knows? The fact of the matter is, if there are 3,000 instances of voter fraud, that's 3,000 legal voters who have been disenfranchised. We must investigate that. That's number 2. Number 3, in Michigan, a 118-year-old by the name of William Bradley voted via absentee ballot in Wayne County, Michigan. The problem is, Mr. Bradley died in 1984, which means that someone fraudulently filled out his ballot. Now, we know that dead people vote in Chicago all the time. We remember that from the Obama years. Why haven't we done something to stop it? That is worthy of investigation. Okay, then we have a whistleblower for the Clark County Elections Department, also in Nevada, who claims that Nevada poll workers fabricated proof of residence for illegal voters. That's a pretty big deal. It's a pretty big allegation, yet the Attorney General of the state of Nevada has done nothing. The question should be, why not? Even if that's not enough to flip the election, that's enough to investigate, because those are legal voters, or not the allegations of fraud. Legal voters are disenfranchised whenever anyone commits fraud. Okay, so next one. We have, going down to Georgia, Fulton County, Georgia. There were 132,000 change of address red flags that were identified by poll workers and the election boards in that area. Should we investigate further? Should we make sure that those were valid, legitimate address changes? Of course we should. That's over 100,000 people. Even if a fraction of that is fraudulent, we should investigate. In Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Elections Commission issued a directive in mid-October giving themselves authority, by the way, in contradiction of state law, which I'll get to in a moment, to fix, let's put that in quotes, fix incomplete or spoiled ballots that are missing witness signatures. The Wisconsin Elections Commission cannot give themselves authority to do any such thing. That authority has to come from the legislature. So they gave themselves illegitimate authority to fix missing witness signatures when they should not count ballots that are missing witness signatures. Okay, so that's a pretty big deal, especially in Wisconsin. Then we have Detroit. There's an election fraud lawsuit that's happening right now in the city of Detroit that is alleging the backdating of ballots. The backdating of ballots and no matching signatures. This is what a city employee says. She says she was asked to backdate ballots. This is her quote. "I was asked by my supervisor to adjust the mailing date of these absentee ballot packages to be dated earlier than they were actually sent. The supervisor was making announcements for all workers to engage in this practice." End quote. Is that not worthy of an investigation? Somebody who's willing to go on record and tell you specifically how the fraud was committed and what the fraud was? And we'll get to this in a second. Well, let me finish my examples and then I'll get to my commentary. Of course, we have the election observers, by the way, too, who were banned from observing only if they were Republicans, only if they were Trump supporters. And then the $1 million thing here is in Pennsylvania, ballots arriving without postmarks after the election. Fortunately, Supreme Court Justice Alito issued an order that any ballots that arrived after 8 p.m. on Election Day must be segregated and secured, and if they are going to be counted, they must be counted separately. Thank goodness. But that took several days before that order was issued. So when we're talking about, do we have proof? Do we have evidence of voter fraud? Hell yeah, we have evidence of voter fraud. You can see it right before your very eyes. Now, is that enough to flip the election? I don't know. Is it anecdotal? Is it individual instances? Is it institutionalized? I don't know. But we have a responsibility to ourselves and to our fellow voters to make sure that people are not being disenfranchised, that no one is spoiling someone else's vote by casting a fraudulent ballot. So is President Trump prudent to litigate? Sure, in these specific cases. Is Attorney General Barr well within his right and responsibility, his duty to tell federal prosecutors to investigate? Sure, because it doesn't matter if you're conservative or if you're liberal, whether you're Democrat or you're Republican, you should want our elections to be as secure as possible. And even if it means that we can just secure it now for the next time, at the very least, anybody who doesn't want to do that, you have to ask them, why wouldn't you want to do that? Why wouldn't you want to secure that? Okay, so that's the first question, essentially. That is there voter fraud? Is it significant enough to investigate and litigate? And was it significant enough to change the outcome of the election? That's the first question. The second question puts voter fraud aside for just a second and says, what happened in this election? You know, after elections happen, they're usually what we call autopsies of the election, where each individual party, their candidate, their campaign, their apparatus analyzes what went right and what went wrong so that they can do better the next time. So what happened this time? Because if you had asked me, 6-8 months ago, back in March before COVID, if I thought President Trump would win in a blowout, I would have said an absolute blowout. It didn't even matter what Democrat would have. At that time, I would have said he will win in an absolute blowout. So what happened? Here's what I believe happened. Dirty politics happened. And when I say dirty politics, I mean Republicans and the Trump administration were out-electioneered. Now, I know that that's maybe not a popular thing to say, but it is what I believe happened. And this is what I mean. They took advantage of COVID. Now, anybody who's been following me for the last 9 months knows that the science has not been in alignment with the political policies relating to COVID, right? And whether or not a politician did right or wrong in respect to COVID the first month, fine. We didn't have information. But after that first month, there's really no excuse not to have the proper not to have the proper policy to match the science, because we do know a lot about COVID now versus before. So the reason I bring this up is because the Democrats aren't stupid. They may be immoral, they may have different principles than us, but they're not stupid, and they specifically stoked fear in the American public to render people hysterical and therefore